And so that history has become a part of my life, and the examples that were set by not only my parents but my grandparents and the rest of the family have more or less made me who I am. There's so many things going on, and we're trying to be, all things to all people. If you love everybody, regardless of who they are, I think it's a freeing experience because you don't try to judge anybody.
All right, welcome to the Rad Dad Podcast. This is episode 23. I have my, grandpa-in-law,
Yes.
Brent Wood. So I'm super excited for this episode. The reason being, if there's two people that would be at the top of my podcast list, it would be my grandpas that I grew up with, and they're not here. So I figured
We're stand-ins.
No, not at all. But I am excited about this episode because I love to, have conversations with you in your living room. We've had some great conversations, but to be able to do that on the podcast and have this is special. So
yes, it is for me too.
Good. Well, just to start off, tell me a little bit about your upbringing, maybe some highlights from your childhood.
Okay. I was born in Orem in 1947, and a year later, my parents moved to Canada, British Columbia. My dad had started a lumber business up there, and so we lived up in British Columbia for the next, I think, about 6 years. And then we moved back to Utah Valley, and we lived mostly in Provo for a number of years. And then I left on a mission for the church in 1966. And my upbringing was a good one in the sense that I feel like my parents were my idols. My dad lived to be almost 90, my mother 92. And I learned so much from my parents over the years that have stayed with me all my life. And people can have a best friend, or they can have someone they idolize. And I idolized Dad, and I idolized Mom. And one side note about Mom, I thought, I knew everything about my mother. But not too long ago, I saw a picture of my mother. She was dressed in chaps, and she had a rifle. And she had kind of a vest. And I thought, well, she must have posed for a one of these Western photographs.
Yeah.
And of course, it wasn't. Back in the late 20s, early 30s, she was a part of a cattle drive from the Teton Basin down to Payson.
Okay. And
I thought, well, my family on her side were farmers, so was my dad's people up in the Teton Basin, and life was hard for them. And you hear this expression that that generation is the greatest generation, and I think that's really true because of the sacrifices. I think of how tough it was during the 30s, the 40s. The Great Depression, and they had their version of COVID, where one of my brothers died my mother's brothers died when he was 17. And so that history has become a part of my life, and the examples that were set by not only my parents, but my grandparents and the rest of the family have more or less made me who I am.
Do you remember any attributes that your father had that you were like, that's how I want to be when I'm a dad? And if so, what are those?
It's strange you mention that because I remember when I was a young man, oh heavens, I don't know, not very old. But anyway, my mother sent me to the store to get a gallon of milk. So I walked up to Smith's, a couple blocks north of where we lived at the time. And I got the milk, and as I was walking back home, a neighborhood kid threw a rock at me. And, well, naturally, when you're that age, you have to reciprocate. So I picked up a rock. I found one, picked up a rock, and I threw it right at him. I mean, if he wouldn't have ducked, it would have hit him. So it's probably a good idea he ducked. But the only problem is right behind him was this big plate glass window. And, of course, it shattered it. And I got home and told my mother what had happened. And, it was one of those classic cases of wait till your dad gets home. So all day long, I was sitting on the steps off and on, just thinking about what I was going to say. And that was right on the corner of 7th North and 7th East in Provo. Well, anyway, when Dad got home, he walked in and I greeted him. He greeted me, and he went in, talked to Mom, and he came out to talk to me, and he said just a couple of things. He said, "Son, I'm disappointed in you." That's all he said. And then he walked away. And I thought, why didn't you yell at me? Why didn't he really get after me?
Mm-hmm.
Then it would have felt right. But
Yeah.
anyway, the lesson that I learned from that, I think, is that you don't respond with anger to something that's already happened. It can't be changed. And my dad was a thoughtful person that measured everything that he said, and he was a quiet individual, but there were times when my dad would let loose a little bit, but not very often. But my mother, a quick story about her. Anytime that I was down, I can remember having conversations with my mother, and there was always this self-assurance that things would be fine. I would be able to make it in a class or understand something. And so I guess I was spoiled in the sense that I had two parents that loved each one of us 6 kids, and we could always depend on them. Mm-hmm. And I think I really did want to be like my dad in the best of his ways. So
awesome. What changes have you seen from generation to generation in parenting styles, from your parents to you, to your kids, to grandkids? What changes are going on that you've noticed in parenting?
Well, I think not necessarily with my parents, but I think a lot of parents were more stern, more rule-oriented, and kids would not talk back to their parents. They had this borderline fear of authority, and so nowadays I think that's changed a lot. And I think as parents and grandparents, you have to adapt and make decisions based upon the way things are, not the way that they used to be back then. I'm not necessarily an advocate of resorting to the way that things used to be in regards to discipline, these types of things. I think you adapt to the age, but strive for similar results.
Yeah.
So
that makes sense. And are there any other positive things that come to your mind that you notice in young parents, like any trends or things that they've caught on to that maybe the older generation didn't as parents?
In answer to your question, as I see it was, rephrase that, would you?
Yeah. So, are there any positive attributes that parents nowadays have that their parents maybe didn't?
One thing that really comes to mind, first of all, is I think my dad came to one of my football games in high school, and that was it. But at that time, it wasn't, the conditions weren't such that parents could really take off and go to their kids' basketball or football games. When they could, they would. Now, I think parents are more actively involved in their kids, which is both a good in kids' extracurricular activities and their education. And that's a good thing, and it's a bad thing. It's a good thing in the sense that kids know that they're receiving support from their parents.
Right.
But I think the danger can be parents becoming helicopter parents, where they take over too much and take away the responsibilities that the kids should learn on their own.
Yeah.
So I think that anything like that, though, you look at and you see the pluses and the minuses of both approaches. So
Yeah. So part of a big theme in the Rad Dad podcast is talking about men's mental health. Was that a thing when you were younger? Did you ever hear people talk about men's mental health? Did your dad show emotions? Did you see that much?
My dad didn't show a lot of emotion, but when he did, it was in a way that was very meaningful. I think there are struggles that go on with the youth more now than we went through back then, because I think in a general sense, we've got so many things going on in our lives and in our kids' lives that they're dealing with that are very complicated. And a lot of the things now we didn't even talk about back in the 50s and the 60s. And
was it just not present, do you think? Or did it exist, but it just wasn't flat out was not talked about?
Well,
do you think circumstances have brought on this mental health pandemic that we have?
Yes. And I think it's for the same reason we just talked about. There's so many things going on, and we're trying to be, all things to all people.
Yeah.
And, we try to go to all of our grandchildren's activities, whether they're in a play or whether they're participating in a sport. And we want to support them, because I really do think in many respects it's tougher now to be a kid than it was back in the 50s and 60s.
Mm-hmm. Well, first off, talk to me about your family. How many kids you have?
Sure. My wife is an only child. Her father was an only child. Her mother was an only child. And I came from a family of 6 living children. And when we first met, I thought maybe there might be a problem there. Her coming from an environment where she was probably spoiled. In fact, she admits so. But I thought, well, I never thought of myself as spoiled. But it turned out that obviously that it was a good match, because we adjusted to each other's differences. And over the years, I look at our marriage as one of the best things that happened in my life, the things that we chose. And I think when you get to, I turned 76 the other day. And, when I was a teenager, somebody who was 60 years old was an old person. Now I think I'm 76, but in some ways I think, no, I haven't changed that much. But family life is prime to me. I think, every time we see Link, I just have this great feeling in my heart, and I think, he's a small part of me and a small part of Joanne, of course.
Yeah.
When Katie started going with you, I thought, well, he seems like a nice young man. But then after a while, I thought, I really kind of like Jace. He's top notch. And then, Joanne and I talk about you all the time. I mean, we do all of our grandkids and their spouses.
Yeah.
And I know people get tired of hearing this, family's everything, but it really is. And I can go out in the mountains and enjoy nature and the beauties of nature, go fishing and whatever. And there's a certain satisfaction there, but it doesn't even compare to having kids, grandkids, and great-grandkids. So.
And how many kids do you have?
We have 6. And it's interesting that the nuts didn't fall far from the tree. We have 2 that are teachers. And of course, I was a teacher. And then we have 2 that are accountants, and their mother was an accountant. And then we have 2 that were artists, professional artists, and they're doing quite well today.
And you were an art teacher, right?
I was an art teacher.
Well, there you go.
But the thing is when our oldest son talked to me about becoming a professional artist, I said, don't do it. And he says, what do you mean, Dad? He says, you're an art teacher. And I says, yes, but I also know how tough it is to make a living at it. And you've got to be, I said, Ryan, you got to be really, 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 and I kept going, about 10 or 12 reallys. You got to be really good. And he says, I know, but I can do it. And he did. At the time, I didn't know whether he could latch on it like he did, but he did quite well. And so as each one of our kids has started their lives and moved away from home and tried to grow within their own area of expertise as far as making a living, we take joy in all the differences. I'm glad Ryan or any of the others didn't follow what I wanted them to do or to be. My dad wanted me to become an electrical engineer, and it just wasn't in the DNA. It must have been in his, but not mine. But I admired him for how smart he was in that particular area.
So would you say it's easier to raise kids or to have adult kids? Which stage of life is easier being a parent?
I think they're all hard. And they're all, sounds crazy, but they're all easy too, because little kids require constant attention. And you're always worried about one thing or another. And then as they grow, you also have worries, but they're different. And then when they get to the age where they get married, you hope they make the right choices. But then I think you get to the point where you just want them to make whatever they choose work. Mm-hmm. There's not a right person or whatever. It's what you do with who you've chosen to marry. And the other thing is, sometimes I hear people say, well, this person was meant for me. They were my soulmate before this life. And all I had to do is look around and find that soulmate. And I thought, well, maybe there's a certain amount of truth to that. But I look at the random way in which I met Joanne, my wife. it was a strange situation where I was just finishing up my mission in Minnesota, North Central States, and I flew out on a Friday morning about 7:30, got into Salt Lake about 10, and the registration for classes at the Smoot Building closed at noon. Anyway, we hurried and drove from Salt Lake down to Provo. My dad and I did, and I got up to the registrar's desk, and I looked down the schedule, and I had already picked out classes I wanted to get, and there were only 4 that remained. And I said, well, I'll take this one. And she said, well, it's either take these or that's it. I mean, we don't have any others. So I said, okay, I'll take all 4 of them because I needed credits. Mm-hmm. So anyway, one of them happened to be a religion class. And I was sitting in class after we started the following week. And it was a 2-hour meeting. And I had this girl, Joanne, that was sitting. I had never met her before. I had no idea. She was from Eastern Canada. I'd never been to Eastern Canada. And we just happened to be talking, and her dad was in the military. He had traveled all the way across Canada and met a lot of people. And I asked her, well, did he know anybody in Winnipeg, in that area? Oh, yes. He knew the Wanamaker's. Do you know the Wanamaker's? And I says, of course I do. So that was the beginning, and 54 years later, our marriage still stuck.
Interesting. I didn't know that story, and I was going to ask you to tell it. So what is a lesson that you've learned in the last 10 years of fatherhood that stands out to you?
I think that's easy. I think one of the most important lessons that I've learned is, and this is a generalization, but I think once a person realizes that if you love everybody, regardless of who they are, and you take joy in meeting people from all different walks of life, people with different backgrounds, with different stories, I think it's a freeing experience because you don't try to judge anybody. Everybody makes mistakes. Everybody makes some bad decisions, and you disagree with some of them. But in the end, I think when you love people and you connect with them on any level you want, it's a rewarding experience. And I think some of the stories that I saw that you pulled out of some individuals that you've interviewed before, it became interesting because there's some commonality there between their backgrounds and ours. And a person figures, I'd like to get to know them even better.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, one of my favorite parts of, and one of the things I've learned from doing this podcast is you never really know someone until you sit down and talk. You can make all the judgments you want, but some of the stories I hear, I'm just like completely blown away. And some people I've known for years, and they tell me a story, and I'm like, I did not know that. And I really cherish, like you said, getting to know people and loving them for who they are, and especially people of different backgrounds. I think there's a lot to be said and a lot to be learned from all types of people.
The other day we went to a funeral of a lady in our neighborhood that's she was almost 97. And we've known her for years. But we found out a story at a funeral, and And as people got up to talk about their mother or their good friend, I thought to myself, it's too bad we don't have funerals before somebody dies, because you learn so much about them. This lady, I didn't know. Well, I knew a little bit about it, not much, but one of our granddaughters had a number of surgeries over the years. And this individual would send a note of encouragement prior to each one of her surgeries. And it's profoundly affected her in a very positive way. And I thought, I wish I would have got to know this individual even more than I did already. But that's true with a lot of the funerals you go to. You think, I've known this person for 35, 40 years, and you find out something new and you appreciate them even more.
Interesting. Going off that same topic, I really like that topic of just really getting to know people. People love to talk about themselves, and I feel like they feel more comfortable around you when you take interest in who they are.
Yeah.
Have you applied that in your family with your kids?
Now I'll ask you again, rephrase that just a little bit.
I guess, what have you done as a father to make that connection with each of your kids and really get to know who they are?
Okay. We have a grandson a few years ago that I was having a conversation with, and he was talking about being, not shy, but not particularly comfortable in different situations with people. And I says, we happen to be in a restaurant together with him and his parents. And I was telling him, I says, this is easy. You can make friends with anybody. And once they know that you're interested in them, they'll tell you anything you want to know. And I said, see that couple over there? Do you know them? He said, no. And I says, well, neither do I. I've never met them. Do you want me to make a friend with them in the next 5 minutes? He says, Grandpa, don't do anything. And so I just got up and walked over there, and it was a young couple. And I just told them, I says, hey, listen, will you play a little game with me? They were just finishing up their dinner. And they said, sure, why not? And I says, we're going to make fast friends with you and pull my grandson over here and make fast friends with him. And they were interested. They said, sure, let's do it. So after a while, we conversed with one another, and then I called him over. I motioned for him to come over, and he shook his head. He finally came over, and I introduced him to them and them to him. And it was interesting because once the ice was broken, it opened up all kinds of dialogue. So whether it's a trick like that or when the kids were really young, admiring a waitress that came by, and I told a waitress that our kids thought she was really good looking. They didn't like it, but I think a person has to be comfortable in comfortable situations and in uncomfortable situations. And once they break the ice and they feel good about who they are and their connection with other people, it's easier to make friends, and it's easier to learn how to enjoy people you don't know. But as you get to know them, your appreciation and your love improves to a great deal.
So I agree with you, and sometimes I've caught myself in the thought process of why go make friends when I already have my friends? I already have my family. Why waste energy on a stranger? What would you say to that?
I can understand that, but I think teaching them to get out and break away from their self-imposed limitations covers a lot of different areas. I think helping them do things that they're uncomfortable doing helps them to grow. I look back at my life and I think the biggest regrets I have are not necessarily doing things, but not taking advantage of opportunities to do things that I was perhaps at the time uncomfortable doing. We had a conversation with one of our grandsons a year or so ago about whether or not to stick with a sport. And the grandson was thinking about just dropping out because it just wasn't working for him. And we talked about the idea that maybe there's something for you to learn by following through with this situation, because you'll learn from it and you won't look back and say, I wish I would have stuck with something, instead of just cut it off and moved on. So whether you're trying to learn from new situations yourself, or you're trying to help your children, grandchildren to do the same, it's a matter of dialogue, doing what we're doing right now.
Yeah.
And being comfortable with it.
Do you feel like your career helped you develop that throughout the years? Being able to connect with the students and
yes,
and have those different communication skills.
The first year I taught school was a disaster. I look back on it, and at the end of the year, I thought, I don't want to do this for a living. But I stuck with it, and there's a few lessons I learned along the way, and one of them was that when you've got a very difficult situation, perhaps you've got a kid that's really belligerent and is a kind of a trouble maker, I learned that if you kill them with kindness, they don't know how to respond. But it has to be genuine kindness. It can't be something that they perceive as being an attempt to garner their support. And once you hit that level of liking all people, whether they're politically on your same side or whether they are completely different from you, there's things to be learned. So I don't know whether that answered the question. Maybe I rambled too much.
Yeah, I think, early years back, probably 6 or 7 years back, I worked out of high school with students, and it surprised me how well they are at catching your BS, basically. Mm-hmm. If you're not genuine, they will sniff it out. Even younger kids will. So I completely understand what you're saying there. And I think it goes for anyone, any interaction we have with another human. I think people have kind of a radar, and they can sense if you're not being genuine.
And, in secondary ed, I think it's tough to find the balancing act between being a little stern but being open to kids. If you try to be their friend, it won't work.
Yeah.
Because they detect the insincerity, and you can't be. You're not on their same level.
Yeah.
So there has to be at least a little bit of, I don't know, for lack of a better word, sense of being stern, and yet making sure that that they know that you care about them. So if you have to get after them about something, it's not one where you're angry with them, but you're not going to let some of the things they're doing persist.
Yeah, right. I saw a quote the other day. It was actually a little video, and it said that you're living the good old days right now. And it was kind of geared towards young dads. It showed a young dad playing with his boys. It said, you're living the good old days right now. When you think of the good old days for your family, what comes to mind?
Well, we did a lot. When I first started teaching school, I had to have a summer job, and I worked as a whitewater guide on the Grand Canyon and Cataract Canyon. And I took our oldest kids on a trip with me. And of course, they learned a lot. Some things I didn't want them to learn.
I'm sure.
But, we would make it a point to go to their games, to everything. And the other thing is we would make it a point to go to all of their parent-teacher conferences, which wasn't necessarily a practice by my parents' generation. It's like they didn't necessarily check up on us other than saying from time to time, well, how are you doing in school? I'm doing all right. Okay, that's good enough.
Yeah.
But I think connecting with your kids about a number of different issues on different levels, not acting as if you know the answers, but listening with the idea of making points that they might have not considered in what they're dealing with at the time. Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah. Yeah. And just to add on that, I know just from stories and stuff, you guys did a lot of stuff outdoors.
Oh, yes.
Do you feel like nature was a teacher to your family?
Absolutely. And I'll tell you why. Our kids talk about our trips quite frequently. I mean, we didn't have a lot of money, so we did a lot of camping. Mm-hmm. And so they have these wonderful memories of connecting with nature in ways that can't be discussed. It has to be experienced. And you have to provide the environment where they can allow that communication to take place. And it's something that's felt rather than talked about. So I think it really is important. And I think this is happening more and more now, where people are reconnecting with nature, and perhaps COVID helped spur that along, where people couldn't do the things they normally did, and so they got out and went and enjoyed the great out of doors.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up that point, because I feel like there's a disconnect somewhere with maybe my generation and younger, their kids. I have this theory that we're not getting outside enough. And I've started brainwashing Lincoln. I tell him every day, we're going to go fishing this summer. We're going to go camp in the mountains, hang out by the fire. Because I look back growing up, and when I have conversations with my brothers about our childhood, it's never, remember that one time we played a video game. Remember that one time we watched a movie. It's always, remember those campfire stories. Remember the night games we played in the forest. Remember going to the cabin. It always just seems like our mind just goes to sometime we were outside. And I want to make sure as a father I provide that to Lincoln, especially in a world that's just overpowered with instant stimulation and technology and anything we could ever want at our fingertips. So, yeah, that's my theory, but I'm excited this year for Lincoln being old enough to, take him out in the mountains.
It'd be interesting to just randomly question some of the young kids in school. Well, for example, I remember once I had a quiz, and just as an additional question, I had a random question. Mm-hmm. And all it was stated was inside or outside, question mark. 7 out of 10 said outside. And then I asked them afterward, what did you think I meant? And they pointed out the obvious, of course. Do you like to be outside? Yes. I don't know how that would be nowadays, but I do think that we need to provide more opportunities where kids can experience that. And sometimes I think you have to do that with them kicking and screaming. For example, a few years ago, we took some young men on a river trip. And it was kind of it was a case where the kids, we thought, were enjoying it. But there was one particular kid that I thought, man, he hates this. He doesn't like it at all. He said as much. But a couple of months ago, he came up to me and he says, hey, when are we going to do that again? I says, what do you mean? I said, you were complaining you didn't like it. And he says, no. He says, I really enjoyed it. So
there you go.
He was sending different messages back then. But the fact that he got out there and experienced it, and at the time probably didn't realize how much he liked it. In retrospect, I think that's the way a lot of us are with the experiences in our lives.
Yeah, definitely. One thing I've observed about you being around you is that you have a curiosity for everything. You like to learn, different topics. You like to learn, really dive into new interests and stuff. How has that guided you through your life?
I think if a person does that, it wards off some of the negative effects of current day. I look at some of the greats in history. Well, Leonardo da Vinci, for example. He was a genius in a lot of different areas, and he was years and years before his time, but he had multiple interests. And I see some of the youth now getting caught up in one thing, and they're not experiencing life like I think they should. When kids want to stay at home after school, and I'm talking about after high school, I think that's an unhealthy thing. Get out into the world. That was the message, I think, by earlier parents, is when you get to be 18, goodbye. Not that we don't like you, but we want you to get out and live life.
Yeah.
Travel, go places, do things, try something you're not comfortable with, and you enjoy it. So if I was to give one message to the younger people nowadays, I'd say, do that very thing. Travel, go meet people, go places, enjoy life. Because I really think that at the end of life, I don't think you're going to look back and say, well, we had this thing and that thing and whatever. You look back and you're going to remember the things you did with friends, with family, the new experiences you had. I know that one trip when we were on the river years ago, it was a 2-boat trip. There were 4 guides. You had one guide plus an assistant or helper. And the night before we were to pick up our people to go down the canyon, we were sitting around boat, having some dinner and talking about how fun it would be to just the four of us, two on each 32-foot long raft, go down through the rapids and enjoy everything. And of course, as soon as we got on that topic, we got off it real quick, because our response was to the question was, no, the people are what makes it fun. You get people from all over the country and the world to a degree. And the first day those people get on the boat, you don't know any of them. Everybody's kind of quiet.
Yeah.
But then by the end of the trip, it's like you've got these lifelong buddies that you write to, they write to you, and you go home a better person, not because you were just out in nature, but you enjoyed nature with all of these people.
Yeah.
So
that's awesome. I like that analogy a lot. So with decades of experience in being a father, what would your message to the young father that is just going through it, what would that message be?
Enjoy every single day with them and let them know, either by word or deed, how much you care for them. And they will in turn do the same thing to other people. And I think, that's a simple case, simple question.
Yeah. And just to wrap up this podcast, I ask the same question to every guest at the end of the podcast. And that is, if there's one lesson you want to leave with your kids when you're no longer here, what is that lesson?
I think the greatest gift you can give your kids is to let them know that you loved their mother more than anyone else. And the best gift is to give your kids a good marriage. I guess that's as simply as I can put it. Awesome.
That's awesome. Well, thanks for coming on and sharing your insights, experiences, and stories. I really appreciate it.
Well, good. I'm glad you called. And I was just teasing, about the makeup thing.
I caught on. Well, thanks for being here.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Cool.